Hello, I'm Kelly Taylor Ryan, and welcome to Mainely Unspoken. Today our guest is Mark Finks, who is a citizen of Maine, and he's going to be talking about initiating policy. Welcome, Mark.
Glad to be here, Kelly. It's always a pleasure.
Great. Initiating policy, that sounds very boring.
Yeah, it's you have to call it something that matches the function. And when people think about government, they're usually reacting to something that government has already done. They talk back to the television news at supper time, you know, and they say, boy, I wish that this or that thing weren't happening. I wish they hadn't done that. Well, obviously it had to start somewhere. And what I try to caution people about who have been thinking about government for a number of years, if they've been following this series, we've said a lot of really wonderful things about citizens. We've said that they have the ultimate power, and that the representatives in our government are just acting in a certain sense on our behalf, and they're supposed to act with restraint. The Constitution of our state and of our country is supposed to restrain them from doing things that are too wild or too foolish. So these are all very encouraging things. If people take the time to vote, if they talk to their representatives, if certain things happen to communicate in the system that we have, it's pretty effective. It's really not, unfortunately, what's happening today. What's happening today is that people have a very done-to feeling. They feel that everything hits them somewhat after the fact. They don't know that it's coming, and when it arrives, they're unhappy with it and so forth.
Well, they don't know what's happening.
Exactly, and just reading the paper won't quite do it. You've got to be more actively involved in that. So we want to discuss initiating policy. How do policies get started in our government? The function that the founders identified, and they were very meticulous in their efforts to do this. The government had three principal functions. It would initiate or establish a policy, then it would have some means of carrying it out or administering it, and then finally, in all governments throughout history, there's been some type of judicial power, some way of judging compliance with the law. So they identified those three functions, and they said whenever two or more of the three are in the same set of hands, either one individual exercising those powers or a group exercising those powers, tyrannies result. And there are all kinds of historical examples that we could use, but emperors.
And that's what administrative law, though, happens.
Yes, administrative government consolidates two or more of the functions in one set of hands. But today we want to focus on policy initiation to point out that the key element in the whole process is whether there is a policy or there isn't. There either is a law or there isn't. If there isn't a law, then nobody's regulated. And that's a good thing to bear in mind when government seems too burdensome.
What do you mean? So if they say we're having a policy, but there's not a law to back up that policy, the policy is no good? Is that what you're saying?
Well, it's all very tentative until someone actually makes it official. You can have a lot of different discussions in society, and you can even have working groups and task forces in government, but until they actually sign on the line and make it official, it's not the law of the land.
Okay.
It's a very important thing for people to remember, because that's the step where on a day-to-day basis you can have the most impact. If you've been an active voter and you have a relationship with your elected representatives already, so that when you pick up the phone and call them, they know who you are and something of your doings and the things you're interested in, that's a big plus. But the key thing to remember is that before a policy is made, you have probably the greatest opportunity to either prevent it from happening to start with if it's a bad law, or to shape it so it's no longer a bad policy, but perhaps can wind up being a good one. And that is not just a bunch of Pollyanna. The more discussion there is, the greater vigor a community has in discussing policy, the less tendency there'll be to pass idiotic laws.
But you know, that's a problem, though, because you know, everyone that's been coming on the show, I've been reading that quote from Andrew Johnson back in, I don't know, 1868, and he talks about excessive legislation.
Yes.
So how can we keep up with all these laws? I mean, the legislators can't keep up with it. So how are
Right.
we expected to keep up and discuss these new laws that are coming in?
That's an excellent question, and we're mindful of the fact that Gibbon published his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in 1776, back when we were just emerging with our Declaration of Independence, and that is one of the best written histories of any type in existence. All these hundreds of years later, it's still one of the definitive histories of any civilization. In particular, is about Rome. And when Rome began to decline and degenerate toward the end, its policy volume just went up astronomically. They began making policies for everything and every special interest in every situation. They would write laws or regulations of some kind. And therefore, everybody theoretically got what they wanted. In reality, their civilization was splintering into 1,000 pieces, which lost their ability to cohere and work together. And
Is that where that saying comes with the more laws a society has, the more corrupt it is?
Well, it's one of those apocryphal statements that's hanging around. You'd think that would be true. The concept that the founders of the United States had was that we would be a self-governing nation in the sense that we would have a moral conscience and we would act according to that. We would be a religious people in the sense that we respected God, who gave us the power to start with, according to our founding documents, and therefore we wouldn't require massive amounts of law in order to supposedly control our conduct. And we seem to have
Gone beyond that.
Gone beyond that long ago, and people need to think about that and say to themselves, what true reform can exist in this country unless people are reformed from the heart? And I just let that question hang out there in the air for the listeners and viewers to consider.
When reform on the heart, does that mean the duty they have to watch over the legislators, or the duty they have in their heart to make sure that they do control their own lives?
I think charity begins at home. If you can't have a home and a family that's well regulated, you probably have very little chance as a society of accomplishing that as a community.
Okay.
And that was always the idea of the founders of this country. And the Norman Rockwell picture of America, which used New Englanders in Massachusetts and Vermont, the two towns where Rockwell lived part of each year, as the subjects of his paintings, or good old New Englanders, just like you and me, is a very valid concept. The reason that struck a responsive chord with the American people was not that it was a fantasy, but that they could readily look around them and recognize people who thought and lived and acted the way Rockwell's people did in his paintings.
So getting back to the legislation, there's too much to follow and watch. And even
Seems that way, yes.
Well, look at the Patriot Act, or many acts that they pass. They'll be so long that people will sign it, and they'll sneak in little segments or little
Sure.
paragraphs that gives the government so much more power than even the legislator thought they were giving, because they didn't read it.
Right.
So if the legislators can't follow it, how do we follow it?
That's an enduring dilemma. The first and obvious way to help remedy that is to elect better people to office.
Right.
And better from our standpoint, I guess, or the viewer's standpoint, would be that those people who are as diligent as you'd like them to be, and perhaps who believe what you'd like them to believe. We don't have a delegate system in the sense that we demand or require that the people we send to Augusta or to Washington do what we tell them. That's a delegate system. It's not a representative form of government. Representative form of government is one in which we try to pick the people best qualified to represent us, the ones with the most skill in government. They're a very small percentage of the whole population. It's a talent, like the ability to play the piano or to paint a painting or do...
But it's not just a talent, it's having good morals. This
Yes.
is what the people want. This is what the Constitution says. We're going to keep the power with the people and not give the power to the government. I mean,
Sure.
how many people go into the legislators with that mentality? They don't. I don't think so.
Well, it took people with strong character to produce representatives of equal character and merit. And to us, perhaps that's a no-brainer because you and I agree. But if you look at what the political system is producing, the wimp factor is considerable. The people who tend to run for office in this present age are the people who have what I'll politely refer to as certain ego needs. That they kind of like the idea of holding office.
That's right.
And they wimp out on most of the key issues or questions. They're trying to be as bland as possible and stay as much like the pattern on the wallpaper so that people won't be offended and would be more likely to vote for them. It's just, you're kind of electing the least instead of the greatest an awful lot of the time. That's not universally true. There are some people in Maine's legislature and in the Congress who really are highly principled, who do stand up strongly for the traditional principles America's based upon. There's an equally committed group of hard left-wing Marxist atheists who serve in state legislatures and the Congress. And it's up to the public, I guess, to be discerning enough to decide whether they really want those people representing them or not. I guess that's the question I would pose to the audience and let them think about it.
So it all goes down to searching your heart, finding out who in your neighborhood or your jurisdiction best represents the country's best interest, or your state or your town best interest, and making sure they get elected.
Yeah, well, you find out quickly enough if you'll interact with your local school board, town council, board of selectmen people, and your state representative, state senator. There are enough things happening on a local level so that you can quickly learn what you can quickly figure out what these people are about, and they do need to hear from you on a fairly regular basis. You shouldn't call them incessantly, but you should call them every so often and keep your comments focused and so forth. But if you do that, they will actually develop a relationship with you. They'll know you. And whether they agree completely with you or not is not as important as the fact that you're in there pitching and expressing yourself and interacting with them. Those are very healthy things, and in the course of doing that, you'll pretty quickly learn how starchy and strong they are, how much pressure they can take, and whether they have the courage of their convictions, and most importantly, what those convictions are. So those are all good, constructive things. And when you think in terms of initiating policy, in terms of the way our Constitution is set up, we have only one body, the legislative body, that's supposed to be doing that job.
But that's not really happening.
Not happening now, no. We can get to that a little later in our discussion today, but in terms of the way the founders designed it, it says all, A-L-L, all legislative power shall be vested in the Congress of the United States, consisting of the House and the
Or was
Senate.
it with the people too? Because with a referendum, then the legislative power comes from the people, isn't it?
Oh, there's no national referendum. In the U.S. Congress, it's just the legislative function of the Congress. In Maine, in the state of Maine, there was a wave of populism back at the turn of the century in the 1900s, early 1900s, and that's what gave rise to the initiative and referendum portion of the Maine state constitution. Prior to that, it had been all legislative power shall be vested.
Do you think it's a bad thing that the people get to do a referendum or initiative?
Well, it's been kind of a mixed bag in terms of its impact on Maine politics. If you've noticed here in Maine, in the last couple of decades, there's been a very pronounced tendency on the real tough issues to kick these things out to referendum if the people haven't already initiated it. Sometimes the legislature will, to let itself off the hook, to make itself look as though it's deferring to the public. And that's actually not a constructive thing. It's much better to have the representatives have all the responsibility of initiating policy and then dealing with them at election time, because that's their report card. That's when they find out whether they get to return to Augusta or not.
So it's the report cards that we the people will give the reps that makes them honest and that makes them do the policy that's good for us.
Quite helpful. If they don't have the ability to start with, then this would be like trying to push cooked spaghetti through a tree trunk. You know, not very effective. You got to have something substantial for a candidate before that process works well.
Do we really have to have so much policy every year? I mean, can they be bored for a year and not do anything? I mean, is the state in that bad of a of a condition, or are things changing that fast that we need new policy all the time?
Well, perhaps the best way to look at that, that's a wonderful question. Perhaps the best way to look at that is to say that if you have a system that tends toward instability, if you've gone away from what we might regard as eternal truths, a biblically based, English and American common law based set of principles, the idea that everybody makes their decisions on the basis of knowing there is a knowable right and wrong. You get away from that, you introduce a certain instability into the whole political process. And then you wind up trying to correct all your stupid corrections, so everything becomes more and more and more complicated without necessarily getting any better. Now, I'm making a glittering general statement when I say that, but it's good food for thought. If we were basing our policies on principles of right and wrong, chances are we'd have a whole lot less policy, fewer laws.
And we're basing our policies on?
A relativistic moral standard. We've taught situation ethics in our schools for the last 30 or 40 years, and teaching students that there is no right and wrong. In the government schools, the famous lifeboat exercise and some of these other things that have been around. And you've taught people that there is no right and wrong, and when you start looking at public policy that way, you're basically saying you're going to try to appease or pacify everybody.
Or control them.
Well,
because isn't that what you're doing when you're having all this policy, is controlling everybody?
Well, that's where it winds up. If people would think about that, they might be a little less eager to have all these laws, because the stuckee is the person who has to pay for it and the person who is subject
to all these policies.
To all of the policies. And people find that if Americans and Mainers were candid with anybody who asked them today, they would probably admit that they feel pretty uneasy about this growing power of government. The local communities have built these elaborate town halls that have a kind of a pomp and ceremony about them. Maine never used to be like that. Maine had a little set of unpretentious public buildings and a modest government living in there. And now we have this big elaborate government. Even at the local level, we have all these full-time technocrat administrators who occupy these buildings and who have this appearance of official power and authority. They're actually a kind of spokesman for the federal and state regulators. This is what the regulations say, they tell us.
So are you saying that maybe we need to deregulate the state, deregulate policies, get back more to the bare bones? Even with their constitution, though, in Maine, I mean, they keep on adding amendments after amendments after amendments.
The classic problem that happens with state constitutions, and Maine's is no exception, is somebody will want to make a policy change and they'll want to kind of put it out of reach of the legislature in the average year, because they don't want things repealed the way you can repeal statute law. They'll stick things that really should be statute law in the body of the Constitution. You wind up making the state constitutions bulkier and bulkier for no gain.
Now, and how do you get an amendment to the state constitution? What has to happen?
Takes a two-thirds majority of both houses, followed by a popular vote to ratify.
So you need a popular vote to ratify.
Yes, you do.
And do they add an amendment at least once a year? I mean, is it?
Oh, no. Well, maybe not once a year. There seem to be an amendment or two cropping up every legislative session. It's usually in some fairly technical area, although sometimes it's a biggie. And then these things wind up being on the referendum ballot. What people need to think of in terms of the design of government, if you've been following this series for some period of time, remember that early on we drew a diagram that had been developed by Harry Atwood, the constitutional scholar, back in the 1920s, and he used a circle to indicate each governmental function. He had an executive circle, a legislative circle, and a judicial circle. And he also had a fourth circle for individual rights, which is the component where all the citizens reside. They have their vote and freedom of speech and all the other rights that the federal and state constitution give them, and they're an equal player in the whole process. So if you've got that in your mind, then you have some sense of where you fit in the system as a citizen. You're in the circle with equal power to the branches of government, and there are some checks and balances between these. The ballot, the legislative power to review the appointment of department heads by the governor or the president.
And jury nullification?
And judicial review, which
That would be it, okay.
would include the power to serve on juries and decide guilt or innocence, or the validity of the law itself. And then we also have a judiciary appointed to judge compliance with the law, and you can take your things to court. So people need to keep clearly in mind where they are in the process and what stage the process itself is in.
And which stage is the process in right now?
Well, at any given time, there are ambitious special interests and state departments and so forth who all want more power, more money, bigger budget, more staff, and they're all working to accomplish that. You can guarantee it at any given time.
So it's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
Right. It just keeps growing. So
instead of initiating policy, we would want to do the opposite. Isn't that what the voters of Maine want to do, is to cut down regulation? How do they do that? How do they initiate policy to cut down regulation so they're freer and they have more control?
Well, one of the trendy terms in late years has been this term of sunset legislation or sunsetting laws, where you add requirements to the law that say that they will expire at a certain time unless renewed, so that they come up for systematic review. And then there are various other claims that have been made, especially in Maine, where they were going to systematically go through the laws pertaining to mental health or education or something of this sort, and have a general revision which implies that they're going to get rid of the useless and outmoded and focus on the good stuff. Those processes are no better than the people who carry them out. And I would remind the viewers that that includes the citizenry interacting with the legislators. You wouldn't just send them down there and say, here, you clean this up, since it seems like such a hopeless mess. You've got to take a much more active interest in that, in the policy process than that, and really ask the good questions. What is this going to cost us? How big is this going to make this department? Or if we can't pay for it now, how are we going to pay for it when it's bigger?
Well, why can't we go even to a more firmer foundation and say, well, let's look at the original organic Constitution. Is it supporting that, or is it not supporting that? Is it controlling us more? Is it regulating us more? Is it right and is it wrong? I mean, why can't we go to more basic questions than...
Well, nothing in the world prevents us. It's just that people have lost their zeal for this. They've lost their interest. Now you're interested because you mention this stuff, and possibly the viewers will become interested because they watch this program. These are all questions that your own conscience has to stir you up to pursue. They're good common sense questions, like why can't we do this? A typical thing that you'll hear from a green legislator who goes to Augusta is to say, well, I thought things were a lot more definite, a lot more black and white, and I got up there and found that there were many shades of gray or something. Meaning they've got these programs and issues so complicated by regulations and bureaucracy and conflicting battles between special interests that you don't want to go in there. It's like being in a live fire exercise at boot camp. You pick your head up, it'll get shot off, and they lose their courage. So
and also the people over the years have been used to certain services or policies, and they realize if they go back to the basis, well, these policies or services that used to might not be available to them anymore. And that scares them.
They'll be gone. The whole name of the game these days, the art of appeasement with special interests, is you make sure you throw a bone in every direction.
And you can't do that if you go to the basics.
Not if you're really thinking of the good of society generally, and having people sacrifice something to achieve that. God forbid that we would sacrifice anything to try to achieve a simpler government. It's a real dilemma that people have to think about, What do they want? We have this illusion or this fiction that we can afford to pay for all of this stuff.
And we can't.
The indications seem to be that we can, and Maine especially has really had several rude awakenings in recent years that show us clearly that we're way beyond our ability to pay for the government we have.
Well, you know what amazes me is that the government keeps on borrowing money and borrowing money and borrowing money.
Sure.
Well, if you keep on borrowing money, how do you pay it back? That's like getting into this credit card debt, and you have to go to, what's that, consumers, I forget what it's called.
The consumer credit counselors, and they put you on a diet and make a deal with your creditors that you pay them one sum and they pay the creditors a certain amount every month, and you do that until you're out of hock. That's how individuals deal with it.
Getting into debt is just bad business.
Sure. Well,
it's bad for the family.
Sure.
Sure it is,
Yes.
okay? Because you're more controlled. When you have to earn money and then turn around and give all the money in interests, that's not good economics.
The borrower is a slave to the lender, literally.
So is Maine becoming a slave too? They're enslaving us all.
Yeah, I would say that's a pretty fair statement. You wind up making kind of an idol, a tin god out of government, and you worship that, and you have a monetary system. In one of these programs at some point in the series, we'll have a program on the subject of money that discusses what happens when you try to use debt for money. And basically, if you try to use debt for money, which the United States is doing currently, you wind up with lots and lots of debt because it just keeps multiplying and ramifying. We're deeply into that process as a nation.
Now, when you're in debt, boy, you're on that noose there.
Yeah.
We only have a couple of minutes left. What do we have to remember about initiating policy?
Well, in this program, we've tried to focus on the circle in Atwood's diagram there that deals with legislation, with initiating policy. And people have to remember that it's not a policy until it's made official.
So, and that means that it's passed by the legislature.
Passed by the legislature, signed by the governor or the president, passed by the Congress, signed by the president. And if you can get into that process early on and try to shape things and try to debunk some of the stupid thinking, if a law passes at all, which it may not if the idea is too stupid, but if there's some merit, the concept can be refined, and you can wind up with a better policy than you would otherwise have had. It's very important to do that between elections.
Between elections.
Right, between elections. And then the other thing to think about is you've got to have as high a quality representative as you can find to do the legislating, because he's the fellow who has to decide whether this stuff is stupid or is reasonable. And if he decides it's stupid and he's right, he throws it out, there's no policy. If he decides it's reasonable and good and wise, then you can maybe have a good policy.
Now, what's the easiest way for people to keep up? Is it in the newspaper? Does it come out in booklet form? To find out what the legislator is contemplating? You know, what are they dealing with?
I'd say just communicate with him. He's, especially at the state level, he's busy with this almost all the time. Knows the most about what's going on. You can ask him a few good questions and be brought right up to date. So I would always start by talking with your representative.
So just call up and saying, what are you guys working up there in the State House?
Well, just tell them, give them a subject that you're interested in, a particular concern, and talk to them about that. And you'll find that the quality of that legislator's work tends to be consistent throughout. If he's sloppy on one issue, he's sloppy on another. If he's good at one, he may be good at several others. And that's you have to find out by
But it is in the newspaper, isn't it? Or do they publish it in the newspaper after it becomes law?
There are public hearings for the bills published in the newspaper, so you get them by title. I would recommend speaking with your legislator, school board or council member on prospective policies, because they'll know if the things are coming up for consideration soon, and in general what the status is.
Okay. Well, we're all out of time. Thanks, Mark. It's been a pleasure as usual.
Oh, I enjoy these.
Great. Thanks for watching, and you're going to want to start talking to your state representative, find out what's going on, be active, you know, help form policy, keep this government simple so we stay free. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.